interested, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we're going to get started, everyone.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Austin Ivy Plus Virtual Speaker Series hosted here in Zoom and streaming live on YouTube from Austin, Texas. My name is Stephanie Pace. I'm a realtor here in Austin and the president of the Cal Alumni Club of Austin, an affiliate chapter of the Cal Alumni Association, UC Berkeley, and an active social and professional networking organization of more than 300 Cal alumni living in Austin, Texas.
Hey, and my name is Silky. I'm an engineer and I'm a member of the Cal Alumni Club of Houston leadership team. This event tonight not only represents UC Berkeley, but also represents the Austin Ivy Plus, a collection over 1,000 Austin-based alumni from all the Ivy League schools, the Seven Sisters, and several prestigious private and public universities. Tonight, we are highlighting the incredible work of Austin-based superstar Rodrigo Leal. Here is a little bit more about his mission and his background.
So the COVID-19 emergency has once again highlighted the inequities faced by communities of color and low-income groups. As policymakers and communities identify measures targeted at economic relief and recovery, it is critical to jointly address the longstanding crises of environmental racism and climate change, which are also threatening community health, safety, and quality of life.
As part of Austin's response to the climate crisis, the city of Austin has engaged in a month-long process with the community leaders, environmental justice groups, community-based organizations, and other local stakeholders involved in decision-making around climate and environmental policy to develop the Austin Climate Equity Plan. This session will focus on the process and outcomes of this plan, which establish racial equity as the foundation for climate goals and strategies and prioritize actions the city of Austin and local partners should take to advance racial justice in light of the climate crisis.
Rodrigo Leal is a Harvard alum and a sustainability professional working to improve the way cities and other large organizations address climate change, inclusive planning, and social equity. We have one request for our audience. Please mute your audio when our speaker is talking and remain muted until audience Q&A. If audio does become an issue, we will be forced to remove you from tonight's event.
Okay, so now we are ready to hear from Rodrigo. Take it away.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to speak with you all tonight. So today I'll be focusing on some of the work that I've been doing as an interested community member and also as a professional who's involved in sustainability and climate change issues in Austin and across the country. And this effort is the development of the Austin Climate Equity Plan. And so I'll go a little bit over kind of the history behind this plan, the process that was involved in terms of bringing stakeholders together and centering equity in the work, and then finally kind of the overarching strategies that came out of this plan and where we hope to take the plan in terms of implementation. So just a little bit about myself. I'm, as I mentioned, I'm a Harvard alum, class of 2016. I'm from Brownsville, Texas. I'm from the Rio Grande Valley. So a lot of the issues that I'm going to be speaking to tonight are kind of close to me. I guess I come at this from environmental justice and racial equity lens, given the fact that I grew up in one of the poorest communities in the country. And so to me, this isn't kind of a theoretical or conceptual exercise. It's very real and it's very personal. And so that's kind of the perspective that I bring to this. And that's the perspective that I bring to my work as a consultant in sustainability. And so feel free to ask any questions as I go along, and I'm sure that the team is going to be curating that, but I'll go ahead and get started. So in 2015, Austin City Council passed its first iteration of a community climate plan. And so this was kind of a groundbreaking sort of event for Austin. It it placed Austin among leaders in the U.S. and around the world. It was one of the first cities in the U.S. to kind of commit to net zero emissions. And the original goal from that plan was to reach net zero community-wide emissions. So that includes emissions not just from city government, but from all entities operating within the city to net zero by 2050. And so the plan centered around these different components. They included electricity production, natural gas, transportation, waste management, and industrial processes. But when that plan was developed, the city was at a different stage in terms of how it was thinking about equity. And quite frankly, the sustainability office and the stakeholders who were involved in this plan, equity wasn't really the center of the work. It was mainly about, we've got climate change happening. We have to figure out how to rapidly reduce emissions. What is it going to take for the city to do that? And kind of that was the guiding light. And the implications for racial equity weren't really at the center. And so when that plan was adopted, one of the mandates of the plan was to have, an iterative process where every couple of years we revisit the plan and we determine whether or not there need to be any changes. And when this process was reinitiated in 2020, actually in late 2019, the stakeholders recognized and the city recognized that, we can't address climate change and we can't solve for the issues that we're trying to solve for around climate change if we're not considering the groups that are most impacted by extreme weather events and by future changes in the climate. And so that was a reframing or a revisioning of what a climate plan can be for the city. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of the drivers of this plan. So number one is, we have to rapidly reduce emissions. That's kind of given. So any warming over 2 degrees Celsius from a baseline level could lead to some catastrophic kind of breaking points for the climate system. And so this GIF is not working, but it's essentially just showing, the current trajectory that we're on, and it's way above 2 degrees Celsius. And even with the arrangements or the agreements that were come to by national governments at the Paris Climate Accords, that still wouldn't keep us to 2 degrees Celsius, and many countries aren't, including the US, are not kind of keeping to those commitments. And so what that means for Austin is, as I mentioned, climate change and extreme weather events are going to impact those who have the least amount of resources the most. And so low-income communities and communities of color are going to be disproportionately impacted by extreme temperatures, extended periods of drought, wildfire events, flooding. We've already seen this here in Austin. If you remember the Halloween and the Memorial Day floods and some of them were extreme impacts were experienced in Southeast Austin, where some of the lowest income communities in Austin live. And we also saw this in Harvey and in Hurricane Katrina, which is kind of the prime example of when government does not prioritize and center equity in terms of environmental justice, the kind of destruction that can happen in the face of extreme events. And so this plan, this new iteration of the plan, which is intentionally called the Climate Equity Plan, looks at those intersections between climate change and racial equity instead of taking them as separate issues, because we know that they're intersectional and you can't really address one without the other, or else you're not really addressing the full picture. And so when we think about climate change, what you see on the left is kind of what the 2015 plan looked at, which is eliminate the use of fossil fuels and aim for energy efficiency, renewable energy, moving away from cars, preserving the natural environment, and so on and so forth. And on the right, we have racial equity considerations that we know are impacting the same communities that are going to be impacted by climate change. And we know, as we have experienced through the social movements and the protests that happened as a result of the murder of George Floyd, that these are issues that are affecting people, and they're affecting them now, and they're real, and it's a life and death for a lot of people. It's not, as I mentioned, it's not conceptual, it's not theoretical. It's a day-to-day struggle, a day-to-day burden. And so when we look at those intersections, what are they? Well, public health is a clear one. Concerns around affordability, concerns around accessibility of services, preserving culture, and making sure that we are kind of considering what the potential impacts of any improvements can be in terms of gentrification or displacement, looking at community capacity and how do we empower communities to be a part of the solution and also benefit from the solution. And then looking at issues around the just transition away from fossil fuels. So how do we make sure that those folks who are potentially going to be impacted by moving to a greener economy, how do we make sure that we allow them and empower them to have access to new jobs that are going to be created as a result of that? And also accountability. So thinking about how do we hold people in positions of power accountable when we're looking at climate strategies and when we're looking at climate strategies that are going to impact both racial equity and the environment. And so this plan builds upon multiple plans, and I won't touch on this too much, but in summary, the plan contains kind of 17 overarching goals, and they all look at kind of a 10-year time frame to make sure that we've identified kind of things that could be done within the next 10 years that are very feasible, and also it gives us kind of a way to keep ourselves accountable. And there's 75 strategies throughout the plan, and they all centered equity. So they all kind of look at how do we prioritize any incentives and target communications towards low-income communities of color? How do we look at gentrification and incorporate anti-displacement in those strategies? How do we, as I mentioned, look at a just transition and prioritize training and job opportunities to those people who are going to be impacted by a transition to a green economy? How do we look at public health and prioritize those benefits for Eastern Crescent communities in Austin? And then finally, how do we keep communities of color centered throughout as we continue to learn more about climate impacts and as we continue to identify implementation plans for the actual strategies? And so the climate equity plan is, and I'll go into this a fair amount in the next couple of minutes. It is a product of a community partnership, and it involved hundreds of community members, which was not the case in the original 2015 plan. It is an aggressive plan. So the new goal is not net zero emissions by 2050, but it's net zero emissions by 2040, which is likely one of the most aggressive goals in the entire country right now. It complements existing plans. So as we know, voters passed the Project Connect bond. And so this takes that into account, as well as other plans to prioritize improvements in terms of transportation and energy in the city. And then it's a roadmap, but it doesn't really say, you know, this is step XYZ to get there. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of implementation. And it is the first attempt the city has made to integrate racial equity into a process as massive as this has been. But what this plan is not an exhaustive look at climate change. There's still a lot of issues that we have to consider. There's still a lot of emerging technologies that may not have been incorporated here because we don't really understand kind of the scope or the potential of those technologies. And it does not take into account kind of a cost-benefit analysis, but that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account in terms of implementation. And so what did community involvement look like? So there's a steering committee, and that's where I come in. I was part of that steering committee process as a volunteer. Different working groups were involved looking at different issues around the intersection of climate and equity. And then there was a whole cohort of community climate ambassadors that were actually paid by the city to do outreach in their respective communities. And so this is kind of a snapshot of what the steering committee looked like, and I'm happy to kind of share slides after this presentation. And let me move on to just kind of talk about some of this engagement. And so the community of climate ambassadors, as I mentioned, the city developed this program because the steering committee and the city understood that in order to integrate kind of the considerations that are most important to communities that are disenfranchised or marginalized. The city needed to make a concerted effort to actually reach those groups, to talk to them, to get their insights, and a traditional planning process was not going to make the cut. So in a traditional plan, you'll see the city kind of post things online and say, you know, come to this event. It's going to be hosted at City Hall at like the worst time possible for a person who works or who has children or who has responsibilities that are kind of more important in terms of getting by than attending a city planning event. And so what this tried to do was to take a very targeted approach to engagement. And so the city set aside funds to recruit people who were interested in being an ambassador for the plan. People sent in an application, and different community networks were kind of tapped in order to identify potential candidates. So you see on the right, one of the city staffers, Celine Rendon, she actually was kind of the architect of this effort, and so she reached out to environmental justice groups, to community activists, to community organizers, and kind of spread the word organically. And they referred people who were really interested in talking about climate issues in their community. And so people were paid to do this work, and part of their commitment was to talk to people, maybe do door-to-door kind of talking, or to host focus groups, or to just call people on the phone and ask them what they think about how climate change impacts them and their families. And part of their commitment was to kind of report that back to the city. And there was sort of that feedback loop where we can integrate their findings into the plan and kind of modify the plan or shape the plan and move it in a different direction depending on the kind of feedback that we were getting from community members. I touched on that already. And so how did we integrate equity in terms of the actual plan strategies? And so the steering committee made a concerted effort to develop a tool that everyone involved in plan development could reference to ensure that equity considerations were being integrated in the development of strategies. And so this is kind of a high level overview of what that tool looked like, but essentially it's a multi-step process where we're looking at an issue like moving away from fossil fueled vehicles, for example. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the history around transportation? What are the existing inequities around transportation? What current data do we have that kind of can inform that history and tell us about how bad that inequity is? And then once we start thinking about, okay, here's a solution that looks at moving people away from fossil fuels while also maximizing low-cost, affordable mobility opportunities. That's kind of where you get to step 3 and 4 is contextualizing equity within a strategy that also addresses climate change. And then kind of thinking about, okay, does this strategy meet the values that we set out for ourselves as a group? And we have kind of a set of questions that go along with that. And then thinking about accountability. So is this something that we can measure, or is this something that we could hold the city accountable to in terms of actually having the strategy implemented? And so I touched on this a little bit earlier, but these are some of the equity and climate kind of intersections that we thought were critical and that should be accounted for in the development of strategies. So every time working groups tried to develop a strategy, they asked themselves these questions. So does the strategy improve physical or mental health outcomes? Does it address a public health inequity? Does the strategy lower or stabilize costs related to basic living needs? And that could be like housing, that could be transportation, that could be energy. Does the strategy increase access to a critical service like housing, transportation, jobs? Does this strategy ensure economic justice? Does this strategy kind of involve and elevate the voices of the communities most impacted by climate change? Does this strategy consider the potential displacement implications of an improvement in the community? And then finally, how do we ensure that there are structures in place so that for any given strategy, community groups can hold institutions and governments accountable for implementation in an equitable way? And this is kind of a sneak peek. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but this is an example of kind of what we actually used to ensure that the strategies that went into this plan are actually harming or benefiting the outcomes that we sought to maximize in terms of equity. And so there's kind of a spreadsheet for health, for accessibility, just transition, and so on. And so I'll go ahead and just kind of skip forward. I think I've spoken a lot about the process, and maybe I should talk about outcomes now. And so, so in terms of outcomes, we have this plan. It is in a near final draft. It is a near final draft, and it's going to go to City Council potentially in January of next year. And what the plan includes are the following strategies. So here are some cross-cutting strategies that emerged. Everyone agreed that kind of a focus on jobs and job opportunities that are going to help us move towards a green economy is especially important, especially given the impacts of COVID-19 and the economic downfall related to COVID-19. So this was kind of a timely strategy to ensure that whenever the city is thinking about a job creation program, it can tackle the dual impacts of both economic injustices faced by low-income communities and people of color, and also move us towards climate action. There was also a strategy around kind of regional collaboration and understanding that if we are going to address the climate crisis, it's not just going to all, like, that's not within the scope of the city government for sure. And it's not something that can be done by Austin alone. And so there needs to be networks of thinking, especially in Texas, where the state government is not as amenable to this kind of stuff as the city governments are. There needs to be some organizing among the cities to ensure that we can actually move the needle in a meaningful way without leadership from the state. And then also looking at kind of carbon offsets and different technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so we understand that all the opportunities that we've presented in terms of strategies won't get us to net zero emissions because it's just not technologically feasible at the moment. And so there's going to have to be other ways to reach that net zero number, and that's going to happen through offsets as well as carbon dioxide removal. And so there are strategies by thematic area. So in terms of sustainable buildings, how do we make sure that we electrify the building stock and move away from natural gas, as an example? Ensuring that we're accounting for leakage from things like refrigerants, making sure that we're reducing the embodied carbon footprint of actual building materials. So materials that are used in construction, those went through sort of a birth and a life cycle to get to where they are in Austin, and all of that has emissions associated with it. And so we have to consider where those things are sourced from, and if we're accounting for those emissions as well. And also looking at things like the emissions related to water. In terms of transportation, as I mentioned, like there's a huge connection to Project Connect and ensuring that we're maximizing access to free or affordable mobility options that are not fossil fuel powered. So the more we can get people onto public transit, or the more we can give people access to the benefits of e-mobility, and that's not just electric vehicles, but that's also bikes, scooters, other modes of transportation like people-powered transportation. Making sure that we maximize kind of people's ability to do that is going to be really important, because if we don't move away from fossil fuel vehicles, and that's frankly the largest part of Austin's footprint, we're not going to be able to reach that net zero goal. And then, as I already touched on this, transportation electrification. So making sure that not only we enable people to kind of move towards EVs, but also understanding that low-income groups, low-income communities, for many people, purchasing a new vehicle is just not financially feasible, and it's kind of tone deaf to tout the benefits of EVs when we're not considering, the people who need access to mobility options the most. And so we're also thinking about ways to increase access to the benefits of EVs. So that could be electrified fleets, for example, the electrification of Cap Metro, or the electrification of school bus fleets. Low-income people have access to those. And so if we're able to also electrify those modes of transportation, we're not leaving people out of the solution. looking at food and product consumption as well. So this one was kind of a new consideration in this plan, thinking about, for example, the ways large institutions purchase food items or products, and thinking about making sure that those are kind of environmentally sustainable purchases. And then natural systems as well. This is kind of a newer addition to the plan. So thinking about how we can protect existing carbon sinks, whether that's kind of undeveloped land or natural lands that serve as natural sinks and don't result in emissions. So how do we protect that? How do we give people access to that as well? And how do we kind of protect our tree canopy as well? Because we know that they serve as critical tools in terms of reducing emissions. So that is a summary of kind of what's in the plan. And I'll kind of pause there because I know that's a lot, and I'd love to kind of open up a conversation around what I've just talked about. So if anyone has any questions, I could go on and on, but I'm happy to kind of open it up and see if people are interested in a particular topic or interested in maybe a way to get involved or something like that.
So far, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if you have a question for all the participants, you can just unmute yourself and ask the questions.
We do have one. How can Austin citizens contribute and get involved, from Eli?
Great. So as I mentioned, that's a good question, because it's going to be kind of a fundamental part of making this plan successful, is making sure that there's people who are not, there's people that are external to the city government that are kind of keeping the city government accountable. And so as I mentioned, right now the plan is in the process of being finalized, and it's there was a public comment period. And I also mentioned that, hundreds of stakeholders from the community were involved. And so the steering committee is kind of very confident that the perspectives of different community groups and the perspectives of marginalized groups are incorporated into the plan and are considered in terms of implementation. And so that process is done, and now it's a matter of getting buy-in from the city government and from council members and the mayor. And so in January/February, within that time frame, city staff are going to present this work and the plan, and are going to suggest that city council adopt the plan. And then what happens from there is really kind of the will of city council. So will they commit funding to the plan? Will they commit the city manager to set aside a significant part of the city budget towards seeing some of these strategies be implemented? Will they think about perhaps how the current city budget is assembled, and perhaps redistributing funding away from certain departments towards funding this plan? And I mean, it's not a matter of, I don't want to pose it as a matter of trade-offs, but if the city is really serious about addressing some of these issues, they're going to have to put their money where their mouth is, right? And so they're going to have to start prioritizing the needs of community members who for a long time have been kind of neglected by the city and underinvested, and other parts of the city have seen overinvestment in terms of services or resources. And so there needs to be a serious discussion about that. So if you want to get involved, you want to see that through, when those council meetings are happening, I am sure there's going to be open comment. So one way you can get involved is to actually sign up and voice your support for the plan. Another thing you could do is email every single council member and email the mayor and tell them why you support the plan. You can also email the city manager and tell them why you support the plan. You can also get involved with local community groups and local groups that are working on environmental justice issues. And I'm happy to kind of share some of those groups separately. I can provide some names as well. So those are kind of some things you can do. And Yeah, that's a good starting point.
He had a follow-up question. So thanks. He also said, I'm a strong advocate of electrified public transportation. Is Austin already moving in this direction?
Yeah, so I believe so. I believe that Cap Metro actually has a plan to electrify its fleet, and that's a very positive thing. And then as well, the Project Connect related proposition that voters just voted on passed, and so that's going to provide a huge influx of funding to Capital Metro to be able to expand the rail system and expand bus rapid transit opportunities. But also there was a kind of a partner proposition that was passed to provide more robust sidewalk and bike infrastructure. And that is also an enabler of electrified transportation when you're thinking about scooters or e-bikes or any kind of micro mobility that's electrified. And also, Austin Energy is very kind of involved in providing the infrastructure that's needed for personal electric vehicles. So that's kind of another aspect of it. But I think that Cap Metro is well on its way towards electrifying its fleets. And I think you'll even see some of those electrified buses out in the city right now. If I remember correctly, I remember them unveiling a couple of them a couple months ago, and they seem like they're a big hit.
I do have a question. How does this plan promote new small businesses that are focused on environmental crisis improvement? And I know we had a plastic-free store here a few years ago and just went out of business. I'm just wondering, will this plan help with startup funds or helping any other way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one program that is relatively new that the city developed, and it was a joint effort between the Sustainability Office, the Equity Office, and the Innovation Office, was the development of this Equitable Green Jobs grant. And so that was kind of a pilot project to explore what it would look like to provide funding to organizations that are very focused on green job type opportunities. And so the grant provided funds to a group that is looking at training people so that they can get involved in the solar industry. So training people how to install solar panels, how to do maintenance, teaching them about how to be an electrician of sorts when it comes to kind of solar systems. So that was kind of one group that received that kind of funding. And there were several other groups. I don't know if you're familiar with the group EcoRise, but they do a lot of work in Austin and also in other parts of Texas to introduce students to green jobs and green professions. And so they received money to further that work. And the steering committee of the climate plan thought that that is definitely something that we want to see replicated. And if there are any lessons learned from that effort, that's something that we would like to see kind of scaled up, because especially now with COVID-19 and a lot of people losing their jobs or losing their primary source of income, and seeing as green jobs are rapidly rising in terms of their stature in the market and the opportunities that are emerging from green jobs, that's kind of an opportunity to bridge that gap and to get people skilled up so that they can access those jobs that they wouldn't have been able to access previously. So that's definitely a consideration of the plan. And in terms of how that gets implemented, that example that I gave of the Equitable Green Jobs grant program, that is one way it could be implemented, but it will be up to kind of city council first adopting this plan and then directing the city government to start developing the actual projects and programs that come out of the plan.
So does the city council has a definition for what means by green jobs? I was thinking that, well, if this grant, for example, if I start a business and I'm selling paint, and there's only 1-2 types of paints with lower VOC emissions. Do I qualify as like I'm doing a green business? Like I don't know if this is something that in your plan or defined by the city council.
Yeah, I don't think that there is kind of a hard set definition around what a green job is, but I can tell you kind of the way I interpret it is any profession or role within an organization that kind of helps move you towards more environmentally friendly practices that also address climate change. And so, for example, if through this Project Connect program now all of a sudden there's new job opportunities to be a bus driver or to be an operator or maintenance person for kind of a new rail systems, that I would see that as a green job because that's moving us towards cleaner public transit. But yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something that does need to get discussed in terms of how these programs are designed and how the city decides who gets access to that. I think that's really important.
And then checking the chat box, it seems that some people are still thinking, maybe having questions later. I do have another question is with electric vehicles. So I was in another forum. It was about the trends of oil and gas industry. Houston, I'm from Houston, and so that's why we have, basically we have more frequent meetings like that. So the question is, so for electric vehicles, I'm talking about like a Tesla. It's much like probably like 5 to 10 times more expensive than just a traditional vehicle. So is the plan address any types of incentives to help poor people or like people they are in lower income level to get electric cars, like personal vehicles that is run by electricity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would also kind of challenge a little bit your framing that electric vehicles are necessarily many times more expensive than traditional vehicles, because Tesla is not the only EV. A bunch of EVs by kind of the major car manufacturers, and a lot of them are pretty affordable, and many of them are kind of on par with some fossil fuel vehicles, and that trend is only going to continue. That's kind of a trend that there's no turning back from that. And eventually, I mean, many car manufacturers have already committed to giving themselves a deadline for when they're going to stop selling fossil fuel vehicles, and that's not due to government mandate. That's just them knowing that that's where the market is going. And so if they don't start positioning themselves as leaders and innovators and progressive companies that are actually kind of considering the impacts of their products, then they're not going to be a viable company in the future. But aside from that, Austin Energy does have incentives, and I think there's also kind of state and federal incentives. But the plan does look at how do we increase access to those incentives, particularly for folks who are low income. But that's kind of a difficult conversation because it gets to the question of kind of how do we maximize benefits for the community? Are we focused solely on like personal vehicle ownership, which is not just the issue of growing traffic concerns? Because if everyone's in an electric vehicle, we're still going to have massive traffic worries, and we're still going to have the safety component, which is, the number of deaths that we have every year because due to cars, pedestrian and bicycle deaths due to cars, that's not going to be solved by moving to electric vehicles. So we also have to consider that aspect. So it's kind of balancing those priorities. And I suspect that with this new administration that at the federal level that is likely to be more amenable to local climate action, there might be an opportunity in terms of federal funding that goes to states and to local governments to expand incentives for EV purchasing. And with this plan, we are positioning ourselves as a city to say that we are ready to accept those funds, and we already have a plan to deploy the funds. So we are positioning ourselves to be able to tap those federal funds that may come in the near future with this new administration, and that will just be a benefit for the entire Austin community if we can stop kind of relying on ourselves in terms of funding major initiatives, because we can only fund so much on our own. We're going to need help from the state and from the federal government, and the state government isn't being very, very friendly, and the federal government hasn't been friendly either. But with this new administration change, I think that opportunities are going to be opened up for that.
Thanks for addressing the question in a way that I was not thinking of. Yeah, that you're correct. EVs, there are a variety of EVs that they're more affordable, but I would agree with you that, yeah, so just increasing a number of EVs doesn't solve the problem. The best is to let people to maximize their chances to use public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the plan, or at least the government, or at least the local city government has any plans or thoughts or ideas of how to help the community to transition from the more traditional type of business, for example, like fossil fuel industry, to help them gear towards more to the green business or green jobs? That is something that in traditional business is, they see that, and I can speak for Houston, they would see that promoting green jobs is like a big threat to them, because it's not the business having competition. Are there any incentive from the plan, like stay in the plan, or from the government, or at least some kind of ideas or talks about how to help them in order to do this transition?
That's a really good question, and I think it's I think it also kind of has to do with the community's values and community priorities, because, and I want to make sure that I'm saying this in a way that is open, but is also not going to alienate groups. But just because you have a business does not mean that that business is bringing kind of positive community and societal benefit. I don't think those two things are necessarily always aligned. And I'm not going to name any specific industry or any specific type of business, but if a community says this is what our values are, and with the example of climate change, we care about climate change, we know who is being the most impacted by climate change, we want to do the most that we can to minimize those impacts, and we want to do the most that we can to help people transition to those green jobs. If we do that, there's going to be some people and some business types that are going to feel like that's calling them out. But if that is a reflection of the community's values, it's a question for the business to think about, is this something, can we operate in a way that is consistent with those communities' values? But we're also part of the community, right? Like, just because you're a business doesn't mean that you are not part of the community. If we want this to be a healthy, functioning, democratic society where everyone has a role to play and everyone is invested in each other's health and well-being and interests, and not think about each other as enemies, then we have to think about our role in creating that future that we want to see. So I see it kind of twofold. Businesses have a responsibility in terms of understanding where they can align with community values, or how they can move towards those values if they currently don't align with the community's values. And then the community also has a responsibility to help businesses who may be part of that kind of older guard of industries that may have intentionally or unintentionally known that they were harming the environment. How do we help them transition so that nobody gets left behind? So I think it's a two-way conversation. And programs like the Green Jobs Training Program are an opportunity to help individuals who maybe they're involved in a business that is related to fossil fuels, for example. Maybe they are a mechanic and they work on fossil fuel cars. And maybe they care about climate change. Maybe they're like, you know what? I would love to work in a green type job, but I just don't have those skills. So how do we help them get those skills so that they don't feel like they're married to an industry that is rapidly becoming less and less viable just because that's where the market's going. And I feel like the more we have those types of opportunities, and the more we decide to put funding towards that to help people and to lift them up instead of leaving them behind, I think the better off we'll be as a community.
Thank you.
I see Karina. She's a Cal alum. I know she works for Vera, which is like sustainability standards.
Oh yeah.
Hi, Rodrigo.
She's quietly listening, but I know something's ruminating in there. So.
No, yeah, I'm so sorry I got the time wrong. Obviously, I missed the presentation. I'll have to go back and look. But no, really, I just wanted to really learn about what you're doing in Austin, and I figured the questions will still be informative, and they have been. Just the list that you guys were making, what was going on in my head is a little bit sort of platforms for interaction between government or even communities as well. And I don't know. Talk about this in your presentation, but I was just, I've been a lot of sort of corporate net neutral and net zero kind of events internationally. The sector really is very interested in sort of digging into to helping and working together with the government to figure things out, in at least in many. So I'm wondering, sort of, are there platforms for that here in Austin?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a really great idea. And that's actually something that the steering committee for the climate plan is like, that's kind of one of our current challenges, is trying to figure out what does a platform for collaboration look like, so that, because we don't want to just like have city council pass this plan and then say, okay, well now it's the city's responsibility. And then there's no kind of continuous feedback loop between city government, community members, businesses, other institutions. So we want to make sure that there's some kind of platform where all those different entities can remain engaged and kind of help figure out or solve problems related to plan implementation along the way, and not just leave it to city staff, because it's a community effort. It's not just, driven by the city. So if you have any suggestions or ideas for what that could look like, we've been kind of ideas, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually have, I haven't really been engaged in that level of things, but I mean, the main point that, was being made was looking at sort of national level governments. But, a lot of national level governments are saying, the corporates and the sort of businesses have more money, more knowledge, more ability, and, are doing more actually than governments are. And sort of maybe looking at, what platforms they're currently using, because I think there is, there are a lot of leader companies that are sort of taking big steps. And so fitting into what they have as well as another platform. And just, I think just ensuring that there's transparency in the spirit of cooperation to learn from businesses as well. And you understand that their role also be really helpful. But anyway, some random thoughts I know, because you'll have to catch me up sometime. I'll have to check it out.
No, that's not. I don't think it's a random thought. I think it's very important question, and this was kind of a question that we were just discussing around. What is the role? What are the roles and responsibilities, but not just kind of responsibilities that you assign different groups, but kind of what are your community responsibilities? Because if you're a Google, for example, and you have a major footprint in Austin and you have thousands of employees in Austin, you're part of the Austin community. You're not kind of just get to operate in a magical little land within Austin and not take into account your interactions with the city and kind of what you get from the city, which is a talent pool of amazing people who are in Austin because they love being outside, they love the community, they love the food, they love the culture. Like, you're benefiting from being part of Austin. And so what are you putting into this relationship? And so I think that's a very important conversation to be had with all the different kind of Fortune 500s that are in Austin, and businesses of all types. I think it's really important. It's like a family, you know, it can't be, one person can't be pulling the weight for the whole family, or else it's going to fall apart. Everyone has a role to play.
All right, do we have any last questions? Anyone? Okay, well, that concludes tonight's event. Next Thursday, we'll have Rick Schaff as our speaker. He'll be talking about entering and exiting small business ownership. We hope you have a great evening.